Kiss. The Kiss, it was called. And as the train went into a tunnel, the man leapt on the woman. Smith or Williamson or Pearson?
Smith. I cut a video essay on it. Do you want to see it?
Go on then. But that puts the cinema very truly in the days of the Fairground Sideshow.
Yeah. I intercut it with a section from The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner.
What a bloody good film that was.
That was a good film.
I saw it in the cinema with about 10 others one night when it was released. We didn't understand serious film. Other countries do, and France, I think, still has an indigenous film trade, whereas we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. You better see the screen around.
Yeah. Yes, isn't this the tunnel not far from Brighton?
Yeah, I think so.
The painted scenery was really quite awful.
It was, wasn't it?
And of course the open air studio was in St Anne's Well Gardens, wasn't it? Yeah. There is a plaque on the wall of a house, I think in Ship Street or Middle Street, saying that Charles Urban lived there. Charles Urban, the inventor of the cinematograph. Of course, he wasn't, but he did develop Kinemacolor. He was a Spieler of the first water, I guess, like most early cinema pioneers were. Oh, that's rather good.
Do you like that? I watched The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner just before Christmas for the first time.
Really?
Yeah, and
God, one was about 62, 63.
Yeah, I can't remember now. I did write it into the video, but I can't remember. And when I saw that scene with them getting into the train carriage, I just immediately thought of the kids.
You've been influenced by the cinema pioneers.
Yeah. Well, I was amazed that these people had come from so many of the most influential film pioneers had done their work so nearby.
Because that's all they knew. And of course there were these other people up in Leeds, weren't there, who were, the name is Mitchell and someone. The BBC did a whole series about them.
They were pre-95, weren't they? Before, what people call
the start of the cinema.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, yeah. The early films were like rapidly changing lantern slides, weren't they? They weren't shot on celluloid at all.
Photographs, really, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, the penny slot machines on the end of the pier, the what about the saw machines, is the same principle, persistence of vision, except these were all worn and clapped out when I saw them. But you used to turn a handle which flicked the images before your eyes. The key to cinema is having something through which you can show light. Did I tell you the license, the County Borough of Brighton cinematograph license, at the time I was working in Brighton, licensed me to show moving pictures by means which include the projection of light. And that was in 72. The language was so archaic. And now there is a license application for the Depot Cinema, which one or two local residents have asked me about, because it says to include off sales. And they thought that it might turn into an off license. down by the station. That is not the idea. It was explained to me that off sales, even restaurants need off sales. If you are to allow people to take their unfinished wine home, you have to have an off sales license because it's for consumption off the premises.
Right.
So that's all that is. Obviously, they had pictures of 12-year-olds drinking on the steps of the railway station, which is, they may well do, but that was not the idea. It is a way of enabling people to buy what they have not yet finished with their meal home.
It's not quite so romantic as the line that
Sitting
you
on the
had.
railway steps?
No, this what you said in the 70s with the...
Oh, by means which include the projection of light.
Yeah.
Still a bit of science in that, isn't
Yeah,
there?
there's something kind of analogue
And there was, when I was showing, I used to stand in for the projectionist, or operator is the correct term, not projectionist, operator. Your chief operator, your second operator were the denominations on the wage sheet. It was quite a thing to remember the first dot, top right hand, the first cue coming up is actually the dot to strike the carbon arc on the incoming machine and start its motor running, and the second dot is the changeover. Easy fit shutters between the gate and the lens on a spring to close the shutter on the outgoing machine and open the other one instantaneously and change the sound key at the same time. And depending on the machines, you would lace on 8 or 10 on the leader. So the transition was, people used to think there was some overlap between, no. It was an instantaneous changeover. And if the operators were clever, it worked very well. And then a soldo, who were, well, they started off in Newcastle, run by a man called Sol Sheckman. And the name of soldo was based on bits of his family's name, Esther, Doris and Solomon. So you change with that and you get a soldo. The great investors in the Asoldo circuit, because Sheckman was a Jew of Polish extraction, were the Polish soldiers and sailors who were still here after the war. They invested in Asoldo to a tremendous extent. And it was not a bad circuit. Okay, second and third run, but where they had a good chance, they were the first to make them with armchair luxury. They did those first conversions before rank. Asoldo also were in the vanguard of automatic projection, where the changeovers were done by, the machines were fitted with a device which picked up the circuit generated by a metallic strip on the side of the film, and the first contact struck up the arc and started the motor on the second machine. The second contact to go through did the changeover. So you could manage without having two men in the box. And Rank bought it. It was patented as a soldomatic, and Rank bought it as projectomatic. And there was another system where the whole thing was run from a programmed cylinder with pins in it to mark in holes where various things happened. And that could run if you had a big machine that would play 6,000 foot spools. It would start the show at 2 o'clock. The thing would have clicked round and the lights would go down, the tabs would open and the image would hit the screen.
What year was this?
Well, the Granada Enfield had that drum system in 65.
So a lot of the things that we have now, no projectionists and
that started 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Because the problem was to get skilled operators. People didn't want to spend the days in an operating box. Imagine 2 of you up in the box if you went on the screen at 1 o'clock and finished at 10:30. It was an interesting life, certainly, and the spooling off or plating off as it was called, which probably has other connotations these days. But the spooling off, we used to cheat. We had split spools so that on the last run of a film on a Saturday night, you used a split spool as the take-up. So all you had to do then was just pull a bit off and slap it back in the tin off the spool. So that you didn't have to unmake a programme. You'd spend hours on a Sunday morning or Thursday morning making up. Film transport used to come round on a Thursday night and Saturday night, and into the early hours of the morning they would pick up the film from you'd finished with, and on their way back in the morning would drop off your new prints. And always on a Thursday morning at Enfield, which was a release hall half the time, first thing to do on a Thursday was to check that the films were there for Sunday. If they weren't, you had to ring the renter and see what had happened. And often you would be told, no, they won't come till Sunday morning, mate. That was one of the advantages of playing subsequent run, because you knew no one else had a print. You could get it. And there was one programme, I think it was the Paramount, No Way to Treat a Lady and The Odd Couple. We were sent 3 copies of each film in the end and made the best out of the 3 to be in a showable condition. None of that exists. It's all gone. At Brighton we had a nitrate licence to exhibit stuff from Elstree archives, which did mean 2 operators in the box at all time, and we had to show a slide saying, this theatre is equipped with protection devices in the operating box. In case of fire, these will be dropped. These will now be tested, and you had to do it in the presence of an audience. So there'd be this terrific clang as these iron shutters came down over the portholes. And then it needed the strength of 10 men to lift the bloody things up and get the place in right order for screening again. It was...
Do you think that the way things are done now, do you think it's so bad? I mean, lots of people kind of get very upset that there isn't a projectionist anymore.
Pigeon's not needed, is he? I'll scream blue murder, excuse me. Blue murder! That's the way to deal with those. And no, it changes. Technology advances. You can't stop it. You may lament it. You may lament it, having a thing for another age, but it goes. And it's like Canute. He knew he couldn't stop the seed coming in. He was just trying to prove to the barons who thought that he could. He needed to prove that he couldn't do it. So you have this technology now, developed because it's cheaper, also developed because you couldn't get the skilled operators, I think. It was inevitable. When we were discussing the prospect of putting digital in at All Saints, we discovered it could actually all be controlled by a phone call from Uckfield, that the starting of the machine and everything could be done down a telephone line. And if there was a fault during projection, the system itself would notify wherever control was and it would be rectified. There was nothing for anyone to do, which is why one man is in charge of 8 screens.
So cinema isn't dead?
Going to see big moving pictures in a hall with other people is not dead. But what you might call cinema, or what I would call cinema, has morphed into something else. And that was evident when this big screen transmission of boxing matches and football matches started. And that must have been in the 60s. You would book a seat to see a transatlantic boxing match on the big screen at the Dominion Tottenham Court Road. It was projected television. So all those indicators were there. It's just that at some point, late 50s, early 60s, the need to develop them because they were a way forward was not seen, because people didn't actually see a way forward or a different way of doing it. I think, possibly.
Do you have like a golden age for you?
There are many golden ages. An age I only barely remember, like going to see the 50s version of Moby Dick, could have been a golden age because there were queues and it was a thing to see. To go to a cinema, it was quite unusual. Working in the cinema was definitely a very golden age for me. Being able to change the programme policy at East Finchley was, God, I lived it. It was wonderful. It was really pleasing to see that what an audacious 22 or 3-year-old thought was what people wanted, except it wasn't what people wanted, it was what a certain section of the large minorities which exist in London wanted. And we did so well. I was so pleased. But those days cannot come again, because then you had to wait 5 years before the television release of a film. There was no video. The world was my oyster, or anyone's oyster who wanted to do something different. But now the window between theatrical and domestic release is getting ever shorter. It's 3 months now. And for some DVDs, it is simultaneous. And I think it is acknowledged that the film companies make their money from the DVDs. They get their returns quicker from the DVDs than they do from cinema exhibitions. Which is sad. It's almost the egg before the chicken now. But progress. That the more artistically minded would question if it is progress. But it's technical progress, and you can't stop it. It's been so long in this country before we actually embraced any modern technology. I think Wilson was the first Prime Minister who said, we must grasp the white heat of the new technology. I'm not sure that he actually did grasp it, but that technology was available through the work at Cambridge University and its computer work and Turing during the war. But it didn't suit anyone to see the uses of it then. We still needed, if you like, a hard-working manual class to rebuild the country. What we haven't found out now is the way to deal with being a post-industrial society. And I think any country which had the answer to that would hold the key to the 21st century and beyond. We haven't, perhaps we do see that we don't need the same sort of workforce, but we're still turning them out. And the answer in the future is we will not need so many people to do as much. So we have to rethink the whole way in which society is structured, starting at the top by killing them mainly, I think.
It's interesting that you talk about early on even not needing to have a projectionist and that being okay, that's progress, but that that also reflects everything
that's done. Yeah.
Not just in cinemas.
You used to have the cashier. You had to issue the tickets from an automatic ticket machine. They sort of crept out and you grabbed it quick before it went back in. Then there was someone to tear the ticket in half to make sure, because they were all serially numbered, you based your return to the film companies on the numbered tickets you sold. So you used to have to check taker, tear them in half and only give half back to the patron to make sure that the same ticket was not used twice. And when I worked for Shipman and King, we had the embassy Tenterden. Shipman and King was, in a way, a very progressive company. Before the war, it started to build cinemas in areas which had been designated for housing expansion. Not that anyone knew there was a war, but that was the plan in the 30s. So Tenterden, still a sleepy outpost in Kent, had their biggest style of cinema. Their best and most palatial cinemas were called embassies. The slightly lesser better ones, or those that they'd bought from someone else without spending too much money on, were known as Regent. Some, like Leighton Buzzard, kept their original names, the Oriel Leighton Buzzard. It's really quite a nice name for a cinema, isn't it? But they made mistakes. Shipman and King also owned the Pavilion Hailsham. Places which now need a cinema, but which Shipmans, in their pioneering spirit, saw, but were too early. The war came, and so this development at Tenterden never happened. They built a big embassy style at Welwyn Garden City, which didn't develop until after the war, and eventually they were absorbed by ABC. But you needed staff. So there was a guy who tore the tickets in half to make sure you didn't use the same one twice. Then, because there were often two prices in the downstairs section, you needed someone to sit the people in the right part of the cinema. So you needed usherettes to make sure, hey, you didn't pay 5 shillings for that seat, you only paid 3 and 6. You've got to come down here and sit nearer the screen. It was a labour-intensive business, much more than it is now. There were rules. There was an organisation called the Kinematograph Renters Society, which is now, I think, the Society of Film Distributors. But they used to send representatives in as members of the public, and they would report to the operator of the cinema and the renter on any amount of unorthodox behaviour, like the manager was seen in the pay box, there was no one serving in the kiosk, there was no usherette in the hall. All these things were reported back to the owner of the cinema and the film company to suggest it might need closer investigation. Any ticket issued in error, so say someone wanted a front stall seat and were given a back stalls ticket by mistake, the front stalls ticket had to then to be issued, but the manager had to initial both parts of the more expensive before the ticket could be sold again to show that it had been authorised. We had a row, Shipmans and I, at the Pavilion Hoddesdon, which I had rechristened the Happy Drome in my mind, when the prices were going up from 3 and 6 to 4 shillings, 17.5 pence and 20 pence, to 25 pence and 30 pence. And I wrote to the office saying now that the prices are going up, the patrons are expecting the pictures a little quicker. After all, a baker doesn't charge the same price for stale bread. It was never answered, because if you know that part of Hertfordshire, there is Waltham Cross, there is Hoddesdon, north of Hoddesdon is Hertford. Hertford was the second run. First run, Waltham Cross, it would skip Hoddesdon, and then it would play Hertford, and it would come back to Hoddesdon as part of a split week some weeks later. And the sole purpose of the Pavilion Hoddesdon in those days was to bar the independent at Ware, the Astoria Ware, from showing films more recently than Hertford. That was its sole purpose. And you could think that Rank's sole purpose in keeping the Odeon Lewis open as long as it did was to bar the outlying districts, to stop outlying cinemas from showing a film concurrently. Bars have all gone now. They were archaic. As the quota system has gone, you must know about it. No, never done quota. And ED money, EADY. Well, we had quite a good local national audience for British produced pictures until American talkies came in and American musicals. We had a very innocent, naive way of life, if you like, or if you don't, I think we did, which we portrayed quite well in our own films. But American films offered, gosh, gangsters and things like that. And so American films began to predominate at the box office. There was also a thing called blind booking. You could only have X film if you showed ABC as well. So you were contracted up for films you'd never seen. You had no way of knowing what they were like. So trade shows were introduced, so a film could not be rented out until it had been shown to the trade. That was the first thing. Then, to counter the dominance of American cinema, never from Europe, always American cinema really, came the Quota Act, where first-run cinemas had to show at least 33% British films as first feature, and the same amount of supporting film had to be British made, which is how the Bond films in the end snuck in as British quota, because they were filmed at Shepperton with British technicians and British artists, or Pinewood, as I think was the more correct place they were made. And eventually the quota system had to embrace European films, because when we joined the EU, you had to put continental European films into that quota, because it was against the regulations to support a national cinema against the rest of Europe. And in the end the quota system went. But there was ED money to pay for these British films, which we were required to show. Every cinema ticket over 9p had to pay film levy, which went into a British filmmaking fund. Well, tied up in red tape. We're very good at that, aren't we? I mean, that's how we had no unemployment. We had a lot of bureaucrats.
So, European films weren't really coming into this country until the 70s?
They were. I'm not sure that they really did then. There were cinemas which showed European films.
You showed European films?
I showed European films at East Finchley, and in the original language with subtitles. If you think of the Costa Gavras film Z, and the other one, he did La Veur. Most cinemas showed them in dubbed versions. I didn't like that. You miss the nuance in the portrayal of the roles if you're showing a dubbed film. So I preferred to have the emphasis of the original language translated into English in subtitles. Everyman Hampstead always did it. The Little Theatre Bath always did it. Paris Pullman always did it. The Academy Oxford Street always did it. But at that time, we were few and far between. The National Film Theatre, of course, did it.
You had to go abroad, didn't you, to get a lot of these films?
I didn't have to. It suited me to see what Poland and Belgium and other countries had to offer. So I brought in quite a few films from Film Polski, which was shown in the Cambridge Film Festival and at the Imperial Portobello Road, now known as the Electric, and a few other places, and featured in the Brighton Film Festival occasionally. It's very good.
You had to cross the wall, didn't you?
I didn't cross it, I flew over it. Well, yes, Poland didn't have a wall. It was difficult enough to get to, because in those days you could not go to an Eastern Bloc country without being invited by a state institution. Couldn't just go as, hey, yeah, I'd like to go and see Warsaw. No. You had to apply for a visa, but you also had to have a letter of introduction. Mine was originally from the University Marii Curie Sklodowska in Lublin, which was the state university. And I became very pally with Film Polski, who thought, this is one of the things one learns, their subtitles, Polish films which were subtitled into any other language, the subtitles were stamped with a punch into the print. And they thought video was a great thing because you could project the subtitles by video without damaging the print. That's what they thought. That was interesting to see.
How do you do that?
Pardon?
How do you...
Well, you have a video projector, which there were. Those strange, cumbersome things that showed three colours, which merged into the image. But what the language which is in common use has become hackneyed. So what one is looking for is a meaningful yet different encompassing word to explain what I mean without taking the hour and a half it's done to do this. Because the rest of the world would be asleep by the time I've finished. But you see, East Finchley succeeded because there was a will of the audience to see this program, these programs, and because we were opposite East Finchley Underground, people, it was easy to get to, and they were a willing flock of sheep. Nowadays, I think the audiences are probably more intransigent. So first, through education, in secondary school and further education, you must break down the intransigence of those barriers.
Right, wonderful. Thanks, Steve.